The humidity of Caracas hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke the life out of the sterile hospital room at the Clinica Santa Rosa. My body felt like a shattered mosaic, every bone and muscle aching from the grueling hours of labor that had finally brought my son Mateo into this world. I wanted nothing but the rhythmic sound of his breathing and the cooling shadow of the evening. I craved silence, the kind that allows a mother to stitch her soul back together after the violent miracle of birth. Alejandro sat by my side, his hand trembling as he held mine, his eyes reflecting a guilt I couldn't yet name. For a few fleeting moments, we were in a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of peace amidst the chaos of the city outside. But in my husband's family, peace was never a gift. It was merely a temporary ceasefire. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were conquered. Dona Valentina, my mother-in-law, marched in with the calculated grace of a general surveying a fallen territory. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask if I was bleeding or if my heart was still beating at its normal pace. Instead, she entered, trailed by a procession of 10 people-distant cousins from Maracaibo, aunts I hadn't seen since our wedding at the Hacienda Las Olivas, and even business associates of her late husband. They carried balloons that looked like bloated lungs and trays of pabellin criollo. The smell of fried plantains and shredded beef instantly turning my sensitive stomach. Valentina clapped her hands, her voice cutting through my exhaustion like a dull blade, announcing to the room that today was not about the birth of a child, but the reborn legacy of her son, Alejandro. She declared him a father, a man finally worthy of the family name. While I remained an invisible vessel, a ghost in my own recovery bed, as they began setting up a literal banquet on my medical trays, I caught Alejandro's eye. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding truck on the Autopista Francisco Ferrado. I had warned him for months that his mother's obsession with our lineage was bordering on the pathological. She had spent the pregnancy whispering to my belly in a language that sounded more like a claim of ownership than a lullaby. Nell? Seeing her direct the celebration while I lay there in a stained hospital gown, I realized this wasn't just an overstepping of boundaries. It was a tactical occupation. One of the uncles made a crass joke about when we would produce a proper heir next, as if Mateo was just a prototype. The room was spinning, the noise of their laughter drowning out my son's tiny whimpers, and I felt a cold, sharp realization Valentina wasn't here to celebrate a grandson. She was here to reclaim Alejandro from my corrupting influence. The stench of meat and heavy perfume began to feel like a physical weight on my chest. I gathered what little strength I had left and demanded they leave, my voice cracking but firm. Valentina didn't even flinch. She turned to me with a smile that never reached her eyes, a predatory Caracas socialite smile, and told me I was simply suffering from the hysteria of the week she claimed I would thank her later for, making this a memorable event for the family. Alejandro tried to murmur a protest, but his mother's gaze silenced him instantly. He was a man grown, yet in her presence, he reverted to a frightened boy hiding in the shadows of the El Avila mountain. Just as I felt I might scream, the door swung open again, and a head nurse named Mercedes entered. Her expression was as sharp as a surgical scalpel. She didn't care about the family name or Valentina's influence in the city's political circles. She cleared the room with a terrifying efficiency, threatening to call the National Guard if they didn't vacate the recovery wing immediately. Valentina was the last to leave, leaning over my bed to whisper something that chilled me to the bone. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "Enjoy your rest, Estefanía, for soon you will realize that some debts in this family are paid in blood, not gratitude." The silence that followed her departure was worse than the noise. Alejandro avoided my eyes, fidgeting with his phone. Later that night, while he was supposedly getting coffee, I noticed a small black device tucked into the corner of the baby's bassinet. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't a toy. It was a high-end listening device, the kind used by private investigators in the high stakes. world of Venezuelan oil disputes. I realized then that I wasn't just being watched by a mother-in-law, I was being surveilled. The mystery deepened when Mercedes, the nurse, returned to check my vitals. She leaned in close, pretending to adjust my foredrip, and slipped a crumpled piece of paper into my palm. Her eyes were darting toward the door as she whispered that I shouldn't trust that water I was being served. She told me that Valentina had been seen in the hospital's records room an hour before the birth, bribing a clerk to access my private medical history and something else. Something about a prior incident in Alejandro's past that involved a woman who had disappeared from Caracas 5 years ago. My mind raced. I knew Alejandro had a tragic ex-fiancé, but he had always told me she moved to Spain after a mutual breakup. As the sedative finally started to take hold, I looked at my husband through the glass of the nursery window, wondering if the man I loved was a victim of his mother's madness or a silent accomplice in a much darker game. Morning brought a feverish clarity. I opened the crumpled note from Mercedes. It contained a single name, Isabella Vargas. My breath hitched. Isabella was the name Alejandro had forbidden me from ever mentioning, the Spanish ghost. But the note included a date and a location, a small village near Lake Maracaibo, along with the words, "She never left the country." I looked at Mateo, sleeping soundly, and a wave of primal protection washed over me. I couldn't trust anyone in this clinic. Even the walls felt like they were leaning in to listen. When Alejandro returned, he looked haggard, his shirt wrinkled and eyes bloodshot. He claimed his mother had been calling him all night, threatening to cut him off from the family estate if he didn't bring the child to reason. Suddenly, a delivery arrived. Not flowers, but a heavy wooden box with no sender name. Alejandro opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were baby clothes, but they weren't blue or white. They were deep crimson silk, embroidered with the name Santiago. I watched Alejandro's face turn ashen. He dropped the box as if it were filled with scorpions. There was no Santiago in our family triad, so I thought Alejandro finally broke his silence, whispering that Santiago was the brother he was never supposed to tell me about, the one who died under mysterious circumstances 20 years ago at the family's mountain villa. Valentina had spent 2 decades trying to replace him, and now she had decided my son was his reincarnation. The monogrammed items weren't gifts, they were a branding. The psychological warfare escalated when the hospital's chaplain, a man with a cold, calculating gaze named Padre Ignacio, entered our room. He didn't offer a blessing for the newborn. Instead, he spoke of reconciliation through submission and the divine right of the matriarch, hinted that if I didn't allow Valentina back into the room, there might be legal complications regarding my fitness as a mother. I realized then that the church, the hospital, and even the local police were likely in Valentina's pocket. I was in a gilded cage in the middle of a collapsing city, and the only person who could save me was the husband, who seemed too terrified to speak. But as Alejandro looked at the crimson clothes on the floor, something in him finally snapped. He grabbed his phone, deleted his mother's contact, and looked at me with a fire I hadn't seen since the day we met. He told me we were leaving, not back to our apartment, but to a safe house he had kept secret for years. The detective game had just turned into a race for survival. Morning brought a feverish clarity. I opened the crumpled note from Mercedes. It contained a single name, Isabella Vargas. My breath hitched. Isabella was the name Alejandro had forbidden me from ever mentioning, the Spanish ghost. But the note included a date and location, a small village near Lake Maracaibo, along with the words, "She never left the country." I looked at Mateo, sleeping soundly, and a wave of primal protection washed over me. I couldn't trust anyone in this clinic. Even the walls felt like they were leaning in to listen. When Alejandro returned, he looked haggard, his shirt wrinkled and eyes bloodshot. He claimed his mother had been calling him all night, threatening to cut him off from the family estate if he didn't Bring the child to reason. Suddenly, a delivery arrived. Not flowers, but a heavy wooden box with no sender name. Alejandro opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were baby clothes, but they weren't blue or white. They were deep crimson silk, embroidered with the name Santiago. I watched Alejandro's face turn ashen. He dropped the box as if it were filled with scorpions. There was no Santiago in our family tree, or so I thought. Alejandro finally broke his silence, whispering that Santiago was the brother he was never supposed to tell me about, the one who died under mysterious circumstances 20 years ago at the family's mountain villa. Valentina had spent 2 decades trying to replace him, and now she had decided my son was his reincarnation. The monogrammed items weren't gifts. They were a branding. The psychological warfare escalated when the hospital's chaplain, a man with a cold, calculating gaze named Padre Ignacio, entered our room. He didn't offer a blessing for the newborn. Instead, he spoke of reconciliation through submission and the divine right of the matriarch. Hinted that if I didn't allow Valentina back into the room, there might be legal complications regarding my fitness as a mother. I realized then that the church, the hospital, and even the local police were likely in Valentina's pocket. I was in a gilded cage in the middle of a collapsing city, and the only person who could save me was the husband, who seemed too terrified to speak. But as Alejandro looked at the crimson clothes on the floor, something in him finally snapped. He grabbed his phone, deleted his mother's contact, and looked at me with a fire I hadn't seen since the day we met. He told me we were leaving, not back to our apartment, but to a safe house he had kept secret for years. The detective game had just turned into a race for survival. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance. The sound of the wind howling through the mountain passes sounding like the screams of the disappeared. Alejandro had fallen into a heavy, uneasy sleep on the sofa, still clutching a handgun I didn't know he owned. I took the opportunity to explore the house, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the expansive windows. In the basement, behind a heavy velvet curtain, I found a door that required a biometric lock, something Alejandro hadn't mentioned. My curiosity, fueled by the note Mercedes had given me, overcame my fear. I tried the code that Alejandro used for everything, our anniversary, but it failed. Then, on a whim, I tried the birth date of the mysterious Santiago. The lock clicked open with a metallic hiss that echoed through the silent house. Inside was not a storage room, but a meticulously preserved bedroom. It was decorated in soft teals and golds, the air smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. This was Isabella Vargas's room. On the vanity sat a collection of expensive perfumes from Paris and a silver-framed photograph of Isabella and Alejandro, looking radiant at the shores of Los Roex. But it was the documents scattered on the desk that stopped my heart. They were legal papers for an adoption, not of a child from an agency, but a private transfer of a baby born in this very house 5 years ago. The biological mother's name was redacted, but the father's name was clearly listed, Alejandro Rodriguez. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Alejandro had told me he never had children, that I was the only one who had ever carried his legacy. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the stomach. As I delved deeper into the files, I found a series of letters from Valentina to Isabella, alternating between declarations of love and veiled death threats. It became clear that Isabella hadn't moved to Spain. She had been kept here, a prisoner of the family's obsession with continuing the pure bloodline. And then I found the final entry in a leather-bound diary. They're coming for the boy today. Valentina says he is Santiago reborn. If I don't give him up, she says I will meet the same fate as the first Santiago. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Valentina wasn't just a controlling mother-in-law. She was a kidnapper of her own kin, a woman who traded in human lives to satisfy a ghost. Just as I turned to run back upstairs to Mateo, the lights in the basement flickered and died. A voice, cold and familiar, whispered from the shadows of the doorway. It wasn't Alejandro. It was Valentina, and she was holding my son's favorite blanket. You are always too inquisitive for your own good, Estefanía, Valentina said, her voice dripping with a terrifying calmness. She stepped into the moonlight, her silk shawl trailing behind her like the wings of a nocturnal moth. She explained that this house was where the necessary corrections were made. She didn't deny the existence of the other child, Alejandro's first son. She spoke of him as if he were a failed experiment, a boy who took too much after his common mother and had to be sent away to a boarding school in Switzerland, hidden from the world until he could be molded. But Mateo, she claimed, was different. She saw the light of the original Santiago in his eyes. She believed that by taking Mateo, she could finally atone for the accident that took her firstborn son 2 decades ago, an accident she casually mentioned that had been caused by Alejandro's own childish jealousy. I felt a wave of nausea. Alejandro hadn't just been hiding a secret family. He was carrying the guilt of a brother's death, a guilt that Valentina had used to leash him for his entire adult life. She offered me a deal, one that made my skin crawl. I could stay in the family, live a life of unimaginable luxury in the Venezuelan islands. Provided I gave her full legal guardianship of Mateo, I would be a mother in name only, a social fixture at her side, while she raised the reborn heir. If I refused. She reminded me of the silver sedan following us. She had the police, the courts, and even the local gangs on her payroll. In this country, she said, the law is whatever the person with the most gold says it is. The floorboards groaned above us. Alejandro was awake. Valentina's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine fear crossing her face for the first time. She signaled to the shadows behind her, and 2 men in dark tactical gear emerged her private security. They moved toward the stairs. And I realized they weren't there to protect Alejandro. They were there to neutralize him if he interfered with her collection. My husband was no longer her golden son. He was an obstacle. I had to choose in that split second. Do I trust the man who lied to me about his past? Or do I find a way to burn this entire legacy to the ground? I grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the desk and threw it through the glass window, the shattering sound acting as a signal. If I was going down, I was going to make sure the entire mountain heard me. The sound of shattering glass was still echoing through the basement when I heard Alejandro's footsteps thundering down the stairs. He didn't come alone. He burst into the room, his face a mask of terror and fury. But his eyes didn't go to me first, they went to his mother. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted, becoming something suffocating. Valentina didn't flinch at his presence. She simply gestured for her men to lower their weapons, a small triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She began to speak, her voice a poisonous honey, explaining to Alejandro that I had found the shrine. She told him that I now knew about Isabella and the boy in Switzerland. My heart sank as I watched Alejandro's shoulders slump. He didn't deny it. He didn't rush to my side to protect me from the monster in silk. Instead, he stood in the middle of the room, a broken man caught between the woman he loved and the mother who held his darkest secrets like a leash. Valentina's guards moved with silent precision, blocking the only exit. She leaned against the mahogany desk where the adoption papers lay, tracing the edges of Isabella's diary with a manicured fingernail. She revealed the ultimate leverage she held over my husband, the first son. The one hidden away was not just being educated in Europe. He was the collateral for a massive debt Alejandro had accrued during a failed oil venture in the Orinoco Belt. Debt Valentina had paid off using the family's hidden offshore accounts. If Alejandro ever defied her, the boy would disappear from the boarding school. Lost to the shadows of the Alps, I realized that my marriage was built on a foundation of blackmail and blood. Every kiss, every promise of a future had been a desperate attempt by Alejandro to find a light in the darkness his mother had created. But now, with Mateo in the picture, the cycle was starting all over again. The air in the basement felt thin, as if the mountain itself was trying to crush us. Valentina walked toward me, her heels clicking on the cold tile like the ticking of a doomsday clock. She reached out to touch my face, her skin feeling like dry parchment. She whispered that she had already prepared the documents for Mateo's education abroad. She suggested that I could either be the grieving mother of a child who died in a tragic accident during the storm or the silent, wealthy widow of a husband who had succumbed to his inner demons. The threat was clear. Alejandro was disposable to her now that he had provided the new Santiago. I looked at Alejandro, searching for a spark of the man I married, but he was staring at the floor, his hands trembling. It was then I understood that if I wanted to save my son, I couldn't rely on a man who had already lost his soul to his mother's shadow. I had to become the predator she thought I was. A sudden violent crack of thunder shook the villa, and for a split second, the backup generator faltered, plunging the basement into near total darkness. That heartbeat of chaos was all I needed. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the one thing Valentina valued more than power, her pride. I lunged at the desk, grabbing the diary and the adoption papers, and scrambled through the shattered window I had broken earlier. The jagged glass tore at my arms, but I didn't feel the pain. I landed on the wet grass of the hillside, the tropical rain blinding me instantly. Above, I heard the shouts of the guards and the hysterical scream of Valentina, calling me a thieving peasant. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the perimeter fence. Knowing there was a service gate used by the gardeners near the edge of the ravine, I reached the gate just as a pair of headlights cut through the mist. I expected the silver sedan, but instead, it was a battered old truck, the kind used to transport coffee from the coastal plantations. The door swung open, and to my shock, it was Mercedes, the nurse from the clinic. She didn't say a word, only gestured for me to get in. As we hurtled down the winding, treacherous roads of El Hatillo toward the coast of La Guira, she handed me a heavy, waterproof satchel. Inside was a satellite phone and a map of a hidden airstrip near Higuerot. Mercedes revealed her true identity. She wasn't just a nurse. She was Isabella's sister, part of a clandestine network of families who had been destroyed by Valentina's machinations over the decades. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and I was their catalyst. As we descended from the mountains, the heat of the coast began to replace the chill of the heights. Mercedes explained the dark truth about the accident 20 years ago. The first Santiago hadn't died because of Alejandro's jealousy. He had died because he had discovered that Valentina was systematically poisoning his father to maintain control of the family empire. Valentina had framed the young Alejandro for the tragedy, branding him with a guilt so heavy it broke his will forever. Now she was planning to do the same to Mateo, molding him into a weapon she could control from birth. We reached the outskirts of a coastal village, the smell of salt and rotting fish thick in the air. Mercedes stopped the truck near a dilapidated pier. She told me that Alejandro was following us not as his mother's lapdog, but because he had finally realized that the only way to save his sons was to help me destroy the woman who birthed him. But as I looked at the dark horizon of the Caribbean, I saw the lights of a private Coast Guard vessel approaching. Valentina hadn't just sent her guards. She had called in the favors of the corrupt admirals she owned. The humid air of the Caribbean coast felt like a wet blanket, suffocating and heavy with the scent of impending betrayal. Mercedes led me toward a small, nondescript motorboat hidden under a camouflage netting of palm fronds. She whispered that we had less than 20 minutes before the patrol vessel reached the pier. I looked a satellite phone in my hand, which suddenly buzzed with an incoming message. It was a video file from an unknown number. With trembling fingers, I opened it. It showed Alejandro standing in the courtyard of the El Hatillo villa, surrounded by his mother's men. But he wasn't a prisoner. He was holding a glass of scotch, talking calmly to Valentina. The audio was muffled, but I heard him clearly say that he had led the lamb to the slaughterhouse. My world shattered for the second time that night. The escape hadn't been an escape. It had been a coordinated hurting, designed to get me away from the city and the prying eyes of the public. I turned to Mercedes, my eyes wild with suspicion. But she looked just as stunned as I was. She swore she didn't know anything about Alejandro's involvement in this phase of the plan. But in the world of the Venezuelan elite, loyalty is a currency that devalues faster than the bolivar. Just as we were about to push the boat into the surf, a flare shot up from the hillside behind us, illuminating the beach in a ghostly red light. From the jungle shadows, figures emerged, not Valentina's guards, but men in the ragged uniforms of a local militia, a collectivo known for doing the dirty work that even the corrupt police wouldn't touch. They weren't here to take me back to Caracas. They were here to ensure that neither I nor the evidence in the satchel ever left the shoreline. And that desperate moment, the roar of a low-flying plane cut through the sound of the waves. A small Cessna, flying without lights, banked sharply over the water. A voice crackled through the satellite phone. It wasn't Alejandro, and it wasn't Mercedes' contacts. It was a woman's voice, raspy and filled with a cold, focused rage. "This is Isabella," the voice said. "If you want to live, get to the end of the pier now. Alejandro thinks he's playing both sides, but he forgot that the dead have longer memories than the living," I realized. Then that the detective story I thought I was solving was only the surface of a much larger war. Isabella Vargas wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a ghost who had learned how to bite back. I grabbed Mateo's carrier and ran toward the end of the wooden structure, the salt spray stinging my eyes, as the first bullets from the militia began to whistle through the humid night air.